Are we live? Okay. All right. So, hey, welcome everybody to our Wednesday night Bible study. We are currently going through Genesis 1 through 11. When you go through Genesis 1 through 11, you basically, why are things the way they are? And so that obviously starts with creation. We've talked about the fact that there's two creation accounts in Genesis. So you have Genesis 1 through chapter 2, like verse 3, verse part A, which is like if you ever see that written out like 3A, it means like the first sentence, and then there's usually a second sentence in that verse. And so the first creation account has to do with the formation of the world as we know it, or the world as it began, and then it's been shaped since then through the flood and the fall. Then we will get into Genesis 2, which is the second creation story, which talks about really our function with God and with each other. And so we'll get into that. Genesis 3 leads to the fall. And then we get into Genesis 4, you have the first murder. And so then you're kind of moving speedily toward the flood. And then after the flood, you get we'll probably get through the Tower of Babel. And then we'll not do the rest of Genesis right now because it's 50 chapters. And it's taken us, 6 weeks to get through, like we not got through the first chapter. So today we actually are going to jump in and we're going to do 2 chapters, 2 days. We're going to do day 4 and day 5. If you're familiar with day 4, it's when you get the creation of the constellation, the sun, moon, and stars. And day 5, you get fish and fowl. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. We'll spend most of our time on the astrosphere today as we talk about day 4. Then we'll talk a little bit about the atmosphere with the fish in the hydrosphere, fish and the birds that will be created. And so let me read to you so we're all on the same page, the 4th day. And we'll start at verse 14. And then God said, so Elohim said, let there be lights in the expanse. If you remember, we talked about Rakia as the expanse of the heavens, to separate day from night. Let them be signs for signs and for seasons, for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse. So that's at Rakia we talked about last week. In the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens and to give light to the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the 4th day. We talked about the evening as the beginning of the Jewish day, and then you have the morning being the end of that day. So you have a Jewish day in that calendar. So the astrosphere is what we want to talk about. If you remember back on day 1, you have the creation or you have light on earth. But at that point, because we know here, you get the creation of the sun and the moon and the stars. So you had light, but you had no sun, moon, and stars. And you say, well, that doesn't seem like that makes a lot of sense. But if you go to Revelation 21 and you look at the eternal state, you find out that God will be the light. And so God doesn't need the sun, moon, and stars to have light because God himself is light. And we'll read this real quickly. Actually, I think I forgot to put this in the slide, so I apologize. But if you have your text of the Bible, you can turn to 1 John 1:5. I'll put my pro-presenter guy to test of that, see if he can get it in there quick enough. But 1 John, we'll only spend a second on this. 1 John 1:5, this is what John writes. He said, this is the message we have heard from him, from Jesus, and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. And so who is the real producer of light? It is God himself that produces light. And so God doesn't need a sun, moon, and stars. Now we live because we are perpetually helped by the sun and the moon and the stars. But God doesn't need that, but God is light himself. So when you read the creation account, day one, you have an intrinsic light, which is God giving the light. And then he creates in day four that we just read, the sun, moon, and stars. And so then you have these generators of light. So you have light, and then you have generators of light. So if you think about this, this is a biblical and it's a logical order for us to have these things. And so as we talk about God saying, let there be light, this is in day one. So God says, Elohim says, let there be light. But in day four, he says, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens. And so he says, let there be lights in the atmosphere, or we could say universe. So this is, when he says, let there be light, it's or. And then he says, let there be maor. And so you have two different Hebrew words. And so when you talk about the lights, you're talking about maor, which literally means light givers or bearers of light. So these are the light givers, which would be the sun, moon, and the stars. And of course, by science, and we respect science and appreciate science. And I'll just remind you that science is really to get to understand God. And so that's the important part of science. And so if science is leading you away from God, then you're probably not doing good science. It should move you toward God. So you have these lights that God has hung up in the universe to give us light here on earth. And so I want to give you from the text the four purposes of what God has done in the astrosphere. And number one, if you're taking notes, would be God gave us this day in order to give us rest. We all know that it's important to rest. As a matter of fact, a lot of us here in the room may be feeling like we don't get enough rest. But God, when he created the astrosphere and he created the cosmos or the universe, or however you say it, he created it in such a way as it would have a day-night sequence. And so the idea is that we would be awake during the day and that we would take a time to be asleep at night. And so, that would be kind of the clock that we worked on all the time because it's in the day you work. Now, we know that in our day, people do have night shift and that sort of thing. And if you've ever known somebody work night shift, it can be really difficult because you kind of get your clock out of whack. And so, but the idea that God set up in creation is that there would be a sequence so that there's work and then there's a cessation for work. So biblically, when you think about the day and you think about there's a work rest sequence, so that's a daily thing. So you work and then you stop working. And so you have day where you work and night where you sleep. And so you rest. And then you have, as you read through the creation account, you have 7 days, you have 6 days of work, and then you have another time that you have a Sabbath. And really what God has created for us is that we would have these Sabbaths built into our lives. So you need a Sabbath every day, and that Sabbath would be I work during the day, and then I rest at night, and then you would work 6 days, and then you would rest on the 7th day. And so he builds us in because what we need in life is rhythm. So God has created a world where rhythms are part of our life. And so, we don't want to be workaholics, which is, some of us probably are that. And some of us are restaholics. It's the people you call lazy and slothful. And the Bible has a lot to say about that. And so some of us are addicted to work. Some of us are addicted to rest. But God has created the world, and we see this in the astrosphere, that we would be able to recover. So, as many of you know, I coach runners. And one of the most important things that we do is we have recovery days. And if you don't have recovery days, eventually you will start regressing in your running. So it's like we have hard days where we really run hard. We have easy days. And I have to tell all my runners, look, the easy days are as important as the hard days. And so it's important that you have rest and recovery time. And so God has created the world the way that He's described here so that we would understand that we need rest, that we need to take some time to put the pause button on and recover. And matter of fact, some studies even show that when we sleep, and we dream, where our brain is actually filing away what we experienced during the day. So it's important that we shut down everything and we rest. So like it's active recovery by going to sleep and finding and experiencing nighttime. So the second purpose of the way that God has designed the world with the planets and things is that we find rest. The second one I would give to you is navigation. And so when you read this text and he says, let there be lights in the expanse and let them be signs. So you have day and night. And he says, let them be signs, and for seasons, for days, and for years. He says, let them be lights in the expanse to give you light upon the earth. So he says that it's to help us to navigate our life. So it's the stars, the sun, and the moon are visual representations to help us to make our way. And so we can look at the sky to navigate. So he says he gave them as to be signs. So when you travel, what are you looking for? Like you get in your car and you travel. Now, all of us, it's a little different now than it used to be. If you're old enough to remember having a map, you know, and our atlas in your car, and you open it up on your steering wheel while you're trying to drive. But like now we got like it either in our car or on our phone, we're following a GPS. But even when you do that and you're driving, you're looking for signs, right? You're looking for landmarks. You're looking for street signs. You're looking for signs. And so God has created the world the way that it is in the sky so that you would be able to navigate. So for years upon years upon years, people navigated by looking into the sky, and that's how they navigated their life. And so ancient navigation was that way. So what God has done is give us visual constants in the sky. And so by studying the sky, you could have seen some things that were fixed, and then you had some things that were moving. So as we discovered, like, what was going on in the sky, we discovered that, hey, well, there's these things that are fixed, for example, like the North Star, and then we saw things that were moving. And so the things that were moving, they started calling planets. And it's interesting because the etymology of the word planet is from the Greek and Latin, and it literally means wanderer. So when they described it as a planet, they were saying it's the star that's kind of wandering around. Like you've seen, like that one's moving, that one's fixed, but that one's moving. And so they're called planets because they move. And so these are the ways that we learn to think about astronomy. And so you had fixed things and moving things. And so what they did a long time ago is they charted them out. And the reason they could chart them out was because they're fixed, because it's almost like God was looking at what we were going to need to have, and he started hanging ornaments on the tree. Like that's sort of the picture that you get so that we would be able to navigate. As a matter of fact, ancient sailors who would navigate the oceans before it was GPS and everything else, how did they do it? They would look to the stars, and they navigated by the stars. In particular, they looked for a North Star, which would guide them. You know, we call it North Star, we call it Polaris. And so they navigated the seas based on the sky. And so when God hung these things in the sky, it was to give us direction and which way we should go. So you had these concrete fixed points that help the sailors get across the ocean. And maybe you've even looked at, like, you know, I don't know how to do this, but I guess some people know how to do this. They can put a stick in the ground and look at how the sun's shining to know what the direction is. I'm not that smart, but you know, there are people who can do that. And so all of this is to help us navigate. So that's the second purpose for it. The third purpose for it that I would offer to you is the time factor. So, you know, if you say, what time is it? Yeah, this is what you're getting at. And so we see in verse 14, and God said, let there be lights, day from night. And he says, let them be signs also for seasons, for days, and years. So what do these have in common? They all have a time factor. So if I were to ask you, how do you define a day? Like, and we would say that, you know, we refer to a day as kind of like daylight because we've looked at that. That's one way you can refer to a day. And so you and I we say, well, what's a day? It's a 24-hour period. It's the amount of the time it takes for the earth to do a full rotation on its axis in relation to the sun. So that's why we call it a 24-hour period. So that's a day. You're like, what's a day? Well, it's 24 hours. And so we base that based on what God has done in the universe. So if I were to ask you, hey, what is a year? It's the time that it takes the Earth and the Moon to go around the Sun. So it's 364 days, which are 24-hour periods, to orbit of the Earth around the Sun. So that's how we, calculate years. So if you say, well, what's a month? It's approximately the way that we go through the 4 phases of the moon, which is typically about 4 weeks from new moon to new moon. And so that's how we look at month. So what's a season? Have you ever thought about what's the season? So basically, it's the periods relating to the equinoxes and solstices, which are spring, summer, winter, and fall. And so you have the Earth, which is on a 23.5-degree tilt on its axis, and it orbits the sun. And so in that way, as we get further from the sun or closer to the sun, we get different seasons. So what we see in creation, and we talked about what God's doing, is making separations and distinctions. And so then you have different times of the day and distinctions between day and night, but you also have that in terms of years and months and so forth. And so, think about the way that you talk about time. Like, what we would say, a new day starts at midnight. And then, it goes around until midnight. And so, like, we could say that's a day. But often we talk about, hey, it's a new day. Like, you're trying to encourage a friend, and you say, I know it's been really hard for you, but it's a new day when you get up tomorrow. So the day starts when light shines and they get up out of the bed. And so how we refer to that is the way that we talk about days. And so, it may be the end of the day is at dusk when the sun goes down. And so when we think about what God has done in the heavens, and so you look up in the expanse, or Rakia, and you look up in the Samayim, and you see the heavens, you see what God has done to help us to be able to navigate time. So God created time. Time didn't exist on its own, but God created it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. So then you have time, and you have matter, and then you have space, and so God is at work. And so when you look on your watch and you go, okay, this is what time it is. Right now, it's 6:49. That is all based on what God has created, and so you have a watch that tells you that. But that time is based on the movement of the earth. So how is the earth moving? And so some of you are probably more into science than I am. But if I did a little research, because I don't remember this from my classes in school, I don't think I took astronomy. And if I did, I probably wouldn't remember it that well at this point. But I was just making some notes on this. So the earth is moving all the time, which, I knew that. But it spins at the equator at 460 meters per second. So in other words, since I coach track, if you're going to have a 400-meter race, that's 1 lap around the track. How long would it take you to run 1 lap? Some of you are like, I don't want to tell you. But if you're like a really good runner, if you're going to be an elite runner, you're probably somewhere in the 40s. Like an elite high school runner is probably 46 to 48 seconds to get around a 400-meter track. So 460 meters, that's how far the sun moves as it is spinning around at the equator, which that basically means that the earth is spinning at the equator about 1,000 miles per hour. That's kind of mind-blowing. And here's what I want to say about that. God has perpetually put this in motion, and it's never out of order, and it's never off at any point. And if it is, we're in deep trouble. So God has created a world that can sustain our life. The earth and the moon travel around the sun. It goes 18.5 miles per hour per second, which ends up being about 67,000 miles per hour. That's moving. And this is never off, and there's no variance. The tilt of the earth on its axis is 23.5 degrees. And if it were any more or less, we would either burn up or freeze to death. Praise God, it stays on his axis. And so when we look at this, what we discover, and as you look at the formation of the earth, and what you discover is that God is a God of order. The first thing you learn about God when you read the scriptures, in the beginning, God created the heavens and earth. So the first thing you read about him is that he's creative. The second thing you begin to pick up on is that God is a God of order. As a matter of fact, Paul writes about this, and he says, God is not a God of disorder. And so God's not a God of chaos. He's a God of order. And so God has created a world in which there's order. And so in the beginning of creation, it was, before the fall, it was completely perfect in all of its ways. And so God is a God of order. So when you take a look at the word cosmos, which we translate as the world, so that word in the Greek, cosmos, literally means ordered place. So in other words, the world that God created, the earth that God created, he created with order. And order is important for us to know how to live life, because without order, we have chaos and we don't have anything we count on. In other words, when something's going wrong, we don't know how to fix it. So like if you got a car and it breaks down, you can open up the hood and look at the engine, and there's an order to it. Now, let's be honest, if you're not a mechanic, you don't know what that order is. But somebody knows what the order is and how it works because it was molded that way and made that way. God knows that about the whole universe. So God created the cosmos, which means it's an ordered place, because God is an ordered person. And so that's what God does. As a matter of fact, you ladies, you practice cosmetology, which actually comes from the word to be ordered. And so when you're putting your makeup on and you're doing cosmetics, what are you doing? You're beautifying your face by adorning it in a certain order. Like that's exactly what it means. And so when you see the word cosmos, you need to immediately think there's an order to things because God's created. Matter of fact, when the words that we use, and I love etymology and looking at the background of words, like the word universe means one turn or one turning. So what is the earth? Where is the earth? It's in the one turning, right? It's in the universe. And so we see this, that the world that God created is an ordered mechanism. And so because of that, we know that God is a God of order, which means that God has a way that we should function. And so when you get into, let's say, cosmology, you discover there's order to it. But also, when we get to talking about relationships, there's an order to relationship. God is not creating disorder. So our culture right now is telling us that, hey, there's not this order and that everything's a little bit more random. No, it's not. God is a God of order, and he has a specific order for cosmology, but he's also got a specific order for relationships, and these are how the things that God has set up. And when you get out of that, guess what you get? You get disorder and you get dysfunction. And so like when we talk about something being functional, we're talking about it's moving in an ordered way. And when it gets dysfunctional, it means it's out of order. And so it's important that we recognize this. The fourth thing is perception. So in verse 15, here's what we see. He says, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon earth. And it was so. And then if you read down to 17, it says, and God set them in the expanse of heaven and to give light on earth. So he says it twice. What is the purpose of the heavens and the universe and the sun, moon, and stars? It is to give light on earth. Who needs light? We need light. We don't need to live in darkness. We need to live in the light. And so God has created a world that we can be living on this earth, and we have light as a part of our life because we need perception. And so if you are in the dark, it's hard to see. And that's why, did you catch what John wrote about? He said, and Jesus taught that God is light, and in him there's no darkness at all. So God is clearly perceived, and one of the ways that God is clearly perceived is through the creation that he has made an ordered place, because God is a designer, and he has a design. And so God wants you to see who he is by what he's done. And so we have to have illumination. So God gives us that, and he does that by what he's made. So you ask yourself this question. So why does the sun shine? Why does the moon shine? Moonshine, that sounds funny, doesn't it? So why does the North Star, why is it fixed? And so do you know what the answer to that is, right? Why is the sun shining? Why is the moon shining? Why is the star shining? Why is the North Star fixed? It's for you. It's for me. It's not for God. It's displaying his glory, but God doesn't need that. But he's created a world that's designed for us to be able to live on and inhabit. And he's also created a world for us so that we can navigate, we can rest, and we can have perception, and we can go about our lives and have lives. And so he's created this on purpose this way so that I can see. What can I see? I can look at the world and see that God exists. I can pick up on his attributes. We'll read Romans 1 in a few minutes, and you'll see that Paul says this. Like I can determine that there is a God because I look at the world and I see that it didn't come by chance, but it came by his very word. So, in other words, it didn't form itself, that someone formed it. Matter of fact, I was reading about this the other day. James Irwin, who was on the Apollo 15 mission, he and a guy named David Scott were famous for bringing home what is called the Genesis rock from the moon. I think it was 1971. And so when James Irwin was up on the moon and they were walking, so basically since about the time he was like 10 years old, he had kind of strayed from the Lord, and he was kind of nominal Christian, not really following Christ. He gets up and he's on this mission, and he gets up on the moon, and he has this incredible experience. And there were two things that impacted his life that changed it forever. The first was when he looked back at the earth. So if you imagine, now some of y'all don't think we lived on the moon, but James Irwin says we did. And he says he was there, and he could look back from the moon to the earth, and the earth was about the size of his thumbnail, but he could see the incredible beauty of it. And so he was blown away by that. I want to read to you what he said. He said, "It reminded me of a Christmas tree ornament," which, if you read Isaiah, God says he hung the stars and he knows them all by name. So it's the ornaments on the tree. So he says, "It reminded me of a Christmas tree ornament, a very fragile one, hanging majestically in space." It was very, very touching to see the earth from that perspective. We've all probably seen pictures of the earth from outer space. And it's an incredible view to look at the earth, and it's massive. Even if you've gone up in a plane, if you've been, 30, 40,000 feet, and you look down on earth, it's pretty mind-blowing when you get that perspective of the earth, because you don't live with that perspective. But when you get in a plane and you look down, you're like, man, that's pretty incredible. You fly over the Grand Canyon. When we went to the national championship, Jonathan took a picture that we put on Instagram of SoFi Stadium. It had the national championship logo on it. It was an incredible picture. So when you look down at it, man, your perspective's all different. So when James Irwin was on the moon and he looked back at the earth, he was blown away by this earth, this place that we live, and how incredible it was and majestic it was. It's majestic because the God who created it is majestic. And so at one point on the mission, he had gotten to a place where he was doing an experiment and it wouldn't work. So he decided, because there wasn't a Google, up on the moon. And so he had to try to figure out what to do. And so he decided to pray. And so this is what it says. I think his wife was saying this. He was erecting an experiment that wouldn't erect due to a cotter pin or something of that nature. So he was frustrated, so he began to pray. And Irwin said when he prayed, he experienced the presence of Jesus Christ. Now think about this. He experienced the presence of Jesus Christ on the moon. So wherever you are, God is there. And she said, the Lord showed him a solution to the problem, and the experiment erected before him like a little altar. He was so overwhelmed at seeing and feeling God's presence so close. At one point, he turned and he looked over his shoulder to see if he was standing there. And this encounter, 238,000 miles from the earth, he had with Jesus. This is his testimony. And so when he got back to Earth after the mission was over, they were having one of those ticker tape parades in New York for them. And as they were going in the parade, it was at that moment he decided that he wanted to spend his life, rest of his life, in the ministry. And so he started the High Flight Foundation. And just from like seeing the earth from that perspective, praying to God and discovering that Jesus is with you wherever you go. So like the cosmos is God's. And so there's no place that you can go in the cosmos that God's not there and that God is not at work. And so we see this in God's creation. God made the stars, God made the sun, God made the moon. In verse 16, we read that God made two great lights. And this implies that God was forming these in the expanse, the sun and the moon. In other words, God didn't have to create it. He took that and he molded that into what we see today. So one of the things that's important, if you notice, at this point in the text of the Bible, it says, and God made two great lights. Greater light to rule the day, which would be what? The sun. And a lesser light to rule the night. And the stars. Why didn't he say sun and moon? Because he's trying to tell you that the sun and moon are not to be worshiped. They're just embodiments of light. And we know that the moon only reflects the sun, and the sun is basically a gigantic star. But the reason I think it's a greater light and lesser light is God's trying to communicate to you that these are not to be worshiped. And why would he do that? Because early on, the ancients in particular worshiped the sun and the moon. The Mediterranean cults are famous for making these great lights idols and deities. But they're not eternal because God created them. Only God is eternal. And that which is eternal is what gets worshiped. And only God is eternal, so we worship him alone. Also, we don't worship them because they are not to be served by us. We don't serve the sun or the moon or the stars. What do the sun and the moon and the stars do? They serve us. They were made for us so that we could live. So why would anybody bow down and worship a sun, moon, and stars? They are not deserving of worship. Only the one who made them are deserving of worship. The whole point of the text is to say God is the one making celestial bodies, and they are serving earth and making our earth worth living on. Matter of fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, let me flip over there real quickly. Verse 19, Moses writes these words, and he says, and beware lest you raise your eyes to heaven. And when you see the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven, you be drawn away and bow down to them and serve them, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. So in other words, God didn't create the sun, the stars, and the moon, or anything in the universe for you to worship. He is to be worshiped alone. And so don't practice idolatry by doing that. So how would you practice idolatry? Well, astrology, right? So we're not looking to the sun and the stars and the moon for direction for our life. But we have a whole group of people like all over the world that look to the sun, stars, and moon to influence their life and to make decisions by. That's not how we do that. We follow God and the Holy Spirit and his word so that we make decisions that honor him. We don't look to the sun and the moon and stars. So the lights are there to amplify the fact that he is God and he is God alone, and they point to his majesty. It's an incredible universe telling the glory of God. Matter of fact, Psalm chapter 8, this is what David dives into when he's talking about how he views God. And so let me flip over there real quickly to Psalm 8. Psalm 8, when David is writing, this is basically the psalm. When I went to see the Grand Canyon, I'm sitting there and looking, I'm like, this is what psalm came to mind for me. Because it's incredible. They call it Grand Canyon because it's grand. It's pretty incredible. And so David writes, and he says, O Lord, our Lord, Yahweh, our Adonai, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. And then he says, out of the mouths of babies and infants, you'll establish strength because of your foes and still the enemy and their avenger. And then he says this. He says, when I look at your heavens, so when I'm looking up in the sky and I see the work of your fingers, which are the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, kind of like you putting ornaments on a Christmas tree. He says, what is man that you're mindful, and the son of man that you care for him? And so he goes into this, and then he keeps talking about creation. But what David is blown away by the fact that the God who created the sun, the God that created the moon, the God that created all the stars and hung them in place, and he knows about them by name, he cares about us. That's an incredible thought. Why would God care about us? Because we are uniquely made. We're not going to get into that today. That's day 6. We're just doing day 4 and day 5. But that's why God cares for us. Like David's blown away by the fact that God cares for us. And so when you look up in the sky and you see this at night, you should be blown away, and you should think, who is this that we serve, that God could create this, and all he has to do is speak it, and it is. That's who he is. And so what we see when we look at day 4, we see this incredible universe and that he creates it. So one of the questions, somebody might have is, if this is the way it is, how do you explain light years and all that stuff? And the simple answer for that is what we've talked about when we talked about John chapter 2, and we talk about Jesus' miracle. And I'll go over it again. So Jesus is a wedding. His mother Mary says, hey, they've run out of wine. Can you do something about that? And Jesus is like, woman, it's not my time. And she says, whatever he tells you to do to the servants, do that. And so Jesus, he turns the water into wine. So what happens on that occasion, I'll go back over it with you, is Jesus takes something and he makes wine that is brand new. And how do you get wine? It has to take time because it has a ferment. And so Jesus is able to take something that was there, water, and all of a sudden make something brand new out of it. But when everybody tasted it, it tasted like it was old. So it's not a problem for God to create a world that has light years but is not that old. Just like he created full-grown plants when he spoke them to be, and then gave them seed so they would perpetually do that. And we'll see that he does the same with animals, and we'll see that he does the same thing with Adam. Adam is born a mature man. If you would have met him, like you could go back, but you wouldn't exist because he was the first one. But if you did go back and you met him, he would be a full-grown man. You would go, well, what was it like when you were a kid? Well, I wasn't a kid. Well, how'd you get here? Well, I was just like this when I came about. And so it's not a problem for God. It might be a problem for us to understand, but it's not a problem for God. So if God created mature plants and animals in Adam, would it not be logical that light was created in a usable form? As a matter of fact, when God created the earth, so God is light, and so the world's already turning on its axis, and light is happening day and night, right? So when God creates the sun perpetually to do that, it's hitting in the same way that God's light, when he was just giving it off himself, was hitting the world. God created light with usable form. And so it would not be beyond his power to do that. Because what's impossible for God? Nothing is impossible for God. And so it says at the end of this, God hits the like button, the love button on Instagram. I like what I did. It's good. When God says this over and over about what he does. And I'll reiterate this, and you need to think about this every time you read that it's good. Good to God is that which measures up to his standard of glory. And so what God is saying, I created this. I created the cosmos, and this is good. And there's a number of reasons it's good, but the one reason it is good is because he created exactly what he wanted, and it glorifies him. It makes him look beautiful. It displays his power. So the cosmos is telling of the glory of God. That's what it's doing. And so when God inspects it, so God does a work and he inspects it, he goes, check mark, that's good. And so we have day 4. Now, day 5. See, day 5 is going to be about the fish and the fowl, is a way to say it. It's going to be about filling the hydrosphere with life, and it's going to be about filling the atmosphere with life. And so what we're going to discover is that God's going to create fish, and he's going to create birds. I don't know if y'all notice, we got a new restaurant in town. It's Fish and Chicks. So it's going back to day 5. So you got a place where you can take and eat fish and chicks. All right, so let's read through day 5 real quickly. God said, Elohim said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth and across the expanse or rakia of the Samayim. And so God created the sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed him, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds multiply on earth. And there was evening, and there was morning the 5th day. So God created that which is in the water and that which is in the sky. And so you have fish and birds that are created. So as we dive into this, so to speak, one of the things you'll discover is the waters are now going to be filled with swarms of creatures. You know, I think it was in the KJV when I was growing up, it was teeming with creatures. We don't yet use that word much, but swarming with them. It means there's a lot of them, so God creates all these fish. And so it's the first time the word nephesh in the Hebrew is used, which means to have breath and animation. The plants don't have nephesh, but the animals do, and people will. But they have animation, and so they move. If you want a picture of a life force, you know, one of the pictures of it is that which is swimming in the water. And so, that's where what God is referring to is that he creates in the water this life. And notice this in verse 21. So he creates swarms of fish, and then he has these birds flying above the earth. And so it says God created sea creatures, great sea creatures, and every living creature that moves. He starts off with great sea creatures. And it could be said that these are great whales or great sea monsters. These are the first real creatures he mentions that he makes. And the Hebrew word for this is tannin, which in modern times we often, modern Hebrew, would call an alligator. But historically, it's known as a dragon, Leviathan. And so, you know, if you think about why do we have all these movies with dragons in? It's because people are that creative? No, it's because most likely it's a cultural memory. In other words, these are things that maybe existed long ago that have been passed on from generation to generation that are like a shadow of our times. And so when you read the word tannin in the Hebrew, and at first the great sea creatures, it is often rendered dragon. And I think that's why you see it in the movies. And so God creates these great sea creatures. And here's the thing, it's these great sea creatures are created, and what do people do? They worship them, which they should not worship them. So I said I wanted to refer to Romans chapter 1. And I want you to hear this because it's important, because just like we don't worship the sun, the moon, and the stars, we don't worship anything that's created. If it's created, it doesn't need to be worshiped. Only the Creator is worshiped. And so what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, starting at verse 18, really our problem is we have worshiped created things and not the Creator. Let me read it to you. He said, for the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. In other words, so there's two kind of wraths in the Bible. There's the wrath where God pours out judgment, and it's immediate, like fire and brimstone, flood, that sort of thing. But there's another kind of wrath, is that God gives you over to your sinfulness. And this is the wrath he's talking about here. He says, for the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. In other words, God's giving you over to what you want to do. and it suppresses the truth in your life. And here's what he says. He says, for what can be known about God is plain to them. Like everybody, when they go outside, should be able to recognize that this didn't happen by chance, but there was a God who created this world, because it's clear, because God has shown it to them. What do they see? They see his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power, because it's perpetually going here, in his divine nature. He can do what no one else can do. Having been clearly perceived ever since when? The creation of the world. When's that? Genesis 1. In the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. So nobody has an excuse before God for not recognizing who he is. For all they knew God, so they knew God existed, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking. They had empty ways of thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So in other words, they didn't think right and they didn't feel right. So they didn't will right. So that's the problem for us, is because we've suppressed the truth. We don't recognize God for who he is. He's the creator of all things. And so before him, we have no excuse. We're dark in our mind and we're dark in our hearts. And then verse 22, we claiming to be wise, they become fools. And what do? They exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. In other words, we don't worship the Creator, we worship created things. That's the problem. And he goes on to say, so therefore, what does God do? He gives them up to the lust of their heart and the dishonor. So he keeps on going. He said, like it's a downward spiral. Like, I don't recognize God. God gives me over to my way of living. It gets darker and darker, which, like, remember we talked about God is light, and there's no darkness in him. And so we have poor perception in our hearts and mind. We don't think right, we don't feel right, we don't will right. And so we end up with this big problem because we don't understand that which we see. And so every time that you look at creation, if you've been enlightened, illuminated by the Holy Spirit, so when you look at creation, your thought should not just be, wow, that's really cool, but it should be, wow, there's the God in heaven who created all of this. And that's how you think about it. And so we see this, and then in verse 23, going back to day 5, he says, interestingly, he says, or verse 22, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply and fill the waters and seas and let the birds multiply on the earth. And so you see that God blesses creation, the creatures, and this is the first usage of blessed in the scriptures. He puts his blessing on them. So like he tells them they're blessed, and how they're blessed is they'll be fruitful and multiply. And when he gets to us, he will command us to do that. He'll say that to us. But he says this about the creatures, the fish and the birds. So being fruitful and multiplying is God's blessing in your life. So why did God create for us birds and fish? You ever thought about that? Why we got chickens and ostriches and owls, blackbirds, crows? The first thing, I'm going to give you two reasons. One is fascination. They were created to display the glory of God, just like flowers. Look at the lily of fields. God clothes them. Just like when you look in the sky and you see the stars in the sky. God, like, it's fascinating to look upon the flower and the stars and the animals, the fish and the birds. You ever think why people bird watch? Now, if you're a bird watcher, it means you're probably getting old. I'm just kidding. You know, you put the bird feeder outside your kitchen window and you watch those birds. Oh, look at the hummingbird, he finally came by. But like, there's something in us when we look at that, we're fascinated by watching birds. I'm not like making fun of that. I'm just saying we are. Like we're fascinated with it. Like bird watching is like what people do. They get binoculars, they put out bird feeders, and like God has created them for us to do that. Also fish. It's why people spend, pretty large sums of money to go to the Georgia Aquarium to walk in a place to see fish. Like fish are fascinating. Like, if you've been to Georgia Aquarium, you walk in that little tunnel, and they got, you got like sharks, and you got, what do you call those big whale things in there? What's it called? Yeah, belugas are there, and you've got all these animals. Like, it's why you go to SeaWorld. Like, I want to see, like, the orca, right? I want to see these things. We're fascinated by them. Like, one of the things I haven't done yet that I do want to do is, I don't know if I even told Trish this, but like I want to go like swim with the dolphins. Like dolphins are fascinating. Like we go to the beach at Fernandina like every summer, and like we're always sitting there. You see any dolphins? Like they're fascinating. I like want to get on like a float or something and go out there and see them. Do y'all know what I'm saying? Like, are y'all not fascinated? Like some of y'all are bird watchers, but I'm like a fish watcher, and so like. That's why we have aquariums in our house. Like we have a goldfish, and we have these aquariums because we're fascinated. And God created them for us to be fascinated with because they speak of how great He is. And so that's why you have, one of the reasons you have. And then a little later, you'll discover that one of the other reasons you have fish and birds is for food. Unless you're watching Nemo, fish are not food, they're friends, kind of thing. But like early on, before the fall, there was nobody eating the fish and the birds. They were just vegetarians. So some people like read the creation account like, we're just gonna be vegetarians because that's the way God meant to be. But something happened at the fall and we started eating animals. We saw this guy one day, he had a shirt on that said, I love animals. And on the back it said, they're delicious. And so that's kind of where we fall, as a family. But like, God created all these things for us to enjoy and be fascinated with, but also they're part of our diet after the fall. It's interesting. It takes like 2 to 3 days to digest meat. It takes like a day for vegetables and fruit for us to digest, which is pretty fascinating, and so I tend to eat more meat than I do vegetables, because I don't like lettuce. And I know some of you find that hard to believe, but lettuce does have a taste. It tastes like dirt. So, if it's on, a little shred of it is on my burrito, I know it's been there. Anyway, so you can be vegetarian or you can do others. We talked about this past Sunday. We talked about, there was disagreement in the church where somebody said, I only am a vegetarian, and then you had this other person who was free to eat what they wanted to. And Paul's basically saying, that person who's weak in faith, they can be vegetarian, but don't pass judgment on themselves. And so, like, we're free to eat these things. It's not good or bad. And so if you want to stay eating your salad, you can do that, or you can go to Fish and Chicks and get what you want to eat. God created these things, and like if you notice, like he gets in the fifth day and he says, this is good. It's God's stamp of approval on it. And so one of the things is interesting too, because I want to reiterate this, is when we talked about the plants and the trees and the bushes, and it keeps reiterating each according to their own kind. So evolution teaches that fish basically became birds. If you notice on this day, they're created at the same time. It's simultaneous creation. And so in other words, we don't evolve, and if you'll notice, each according to their own kind, which is telling you that God is creating, we're not evolving. It's not macroevolution. This is what the scriptures teach. So, fowl do not come from fish. They come according to their kind. And God says this is good. This measures up to his standard. So the fish that you see and the bird that flies in the air there be a constant reminder. You know, didn't Jesus say that? Why are you worried? And he says, have you considered the lily in the field? And God clothes it. Would he not clothe you? And then he says, have you not considered the sparrow? That little bird? God knows if one of them falls to the ground. So how much does he care about you? See, all of these things have been created for his glory and for our good. That's what creation is telling you. It's telling you who God is. God's creative. God is a God of order. And God, when we get to day 6 next week, day 6, we'll see God create man in a very special way in his image. Because he's done this for us. Because he cares for us. Praise God. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your grace and mercy. Thank you for the creation that we get to experience all these great things. We get to see these incredible animals. We get to see, the owl, and we get to see, the peacock, and we get to see dolphins and beluga whales, and we get to see your incredible creation. And God, you made us stewards over your creation. And so we want to be fascinated with it, and so that we learn more about who you are. And we look up in the stars at night, and we go out tonight and we see the stars put in place. Let us be reminded that you know them all by name, that you hung them where they are, and that you are personally acquainted with them. But you and our rest and all of these things, but they are to display your greatness. So when we look at these things, don't let us miss what they are saying to us about who you are. And God, if you have been this good to create this place for us, then your intention toward us is good.